Thank you very much, Eva. Thanks a lot for this opportunity. Warm greetings from the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, indeed, where I work as Chief of Democratic Governance and Gender Unit. Let me thank, first of all, the organizers of this wonderful event, the Latvian Parliament, the State Chancellery, and indeed TI Transparency Latvia, Delna, for your hard work putting this event together, and also extend my greetings to the many friends that I saw taking the floor and participating in this event today, especially, if I may, colleagues from the OGP, from the Open Government Partnership, of which we are a supporter. We are a member as an international organization, asking our participating states to embrace the principles of the OGP, and we are really, really glad to see that Latvia is taking such a strong role of leadership in this framework as well. I would also like to congratulate really the Parliament for the work that has been done in regard to this new legislation on lobbying, for the attention that has been given to this very important topic since few years. And congratulations for the inclusive consultation process that has been laid out in terms of getting to a very solid legislation on lobbying, for the availability to learn from international practices that you have shown as a parliament, something that it is to be commended. And also how we personally, as ODIHR, can continue this engagement with you. I was meeting with a working group back in 2019, already giving a short presentation on the issue of lobbying. So I would like to thank you for this opportunity once again, and especially Ina Savoyka for her leadership in that discussion. I will have a short presentation. I would like to share with you a few points, obviously coming after so many great speakers. Several things have been already shared, but I do believe that it is important to keep going over them and stressing them in this process of drafting this new law. Can you please tell me if you can see the slides? Or
Jakopo, we can see your slide, yeah, but the size of the screen is a bit strange. I don't know if you can make it a full screen, maybe.
Is it okay now?
Thank you, it's good.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. I will start with three general comments on the lobby legislation and why it is important to keep them in mind. Obviously, some of these, it is important, I believe, to go through them. The first one is about understanding lobbying as a fundamental aspect of our democracy. And this is key. I think there is a lot of resistance understanding lobbying today as something beneficial for our discussion. There is this very gloomy understanding of lobbying as a corrupt practice, and even the term itself, I understand in Latvia, brings a negative connotation. But indeed, lobbying, it is a fundamental aspect of democracy. It is about political pluralism. It is about informing the decision-making process and getting to better legislation with a wider input of interests benefiting the discussion. And it is about freedom of speech and expression. So this is why a legislation on lobby is important, because it needs to guarantee these fundamental principles of our democracy. This is not to shy away from the fact that obviously lobbying as a practice can have a very negative connotation as well. And obviously, you know that when not a legislation is not in place, or a legislation is not fully respected and implemented, you then run the risk of having a biased decision-making process where the access to the decision makers is in favor of those strong interests that have a privilege towards the wider public. You have a peril of policy and state capture on the long term, where a very small number of very influential individuals in a country or companies can have a total, possibly control over the way that the state is developing its policies. And then the element of foreign influence, as it was already just mentioned also by my colleague from OECD. As a note, I think this brings me to mind all the time about political finance. I think there are a lot of parallels in between trying to regulate lobbying as a phenomena and trying to regulate political finance. Political finance, like lobbying, it's fundamental to the quality of our democracies. We do need financing to our political actors, but there is also that kind of connotation of negative element attached to it, of the role that money play in politics. And when it's not properly regulated, it can really spill into a control, overarching control of the political process by those that have more money and those that can really influence the work of parties. So a lot of connections there, I believe. Moving to the second general point that I think is important to keep in mind is that lobbying needs to be part of a larger national integrity system. This was mentioned by Madam Speaker at the very beginning of our conference and by several other panelists. I do believe that alone lobbying needs to be part of a larger ecosystem that needs to have a strong law on political party finance, who's financing our democracy, why those people are financing those parties. Do they have a lobbying interest behind? Do they have a public procurement behind it? That's the other area that needs to be taken into account. How are the public money and public resources allocated to companies, and whether those companies have invested in lobbying practices before that decision was taken. The aspect of conflict of interest. I think we do need to know when our decision makers are taking decisions and are voting on legislation, for example, members of parliament, whether they do have a conflict of interest and whether they do have met with lobbyists before taking a decision. In some cases, they shouldn't be allowed to take that decision according to some legislations in certain countries. So that's also another aspect that needs to be connected to the lobbying regulation. And then the post-employment rules, the revolving door, the cooling off period that was already mentioned. Obviously, that also needs to be part of that discussion. So lobbying doesn't stand alone in this regard, but it is part of a larger national integrity ecosystem, as we call it. Running to the third point, lobbying is a way to raise transparency of parliaments. And I do take this opportunity to raise this aspect because of the audience and the parliament organizing this conference. And I think it is important to do so. My personal belief is that lobbying is a political issue. It's not an issue that deals with private sector. It's not about regulating the big companies in our countries or economic interest in our countries. It is about the political decision-making process. It's about ensuring that our laws, that our decisions, political decisions, are made in a transparent, accountable, and inclusive way. So the parliament becomes the real focus of the law, if you want, and not only the law and everything else that is built around a law on lobbying. And there are at least a few points that I would highlight. The need for open agendas and very inclusive public consultation. We heard about the work that TI has been doing in Lithuania on this issue, about creating open agendas for elected officials with a great success. We heard from Peter Varga from OGP how the public consultation process is important, needs to be transparent, needs to be pluralistic. So these are elements that parliaments need to take care of. They need to make sure that these are in place on top of a lobbying legislation. The legislative footprint, all the same. We need to know who's trying to influence each single piece of legislation that is discussed in the parliament and eventually adopted. I know and I've seen that the Parliament of Latvia is moving in that direction of creating a legislative footprint mechanism and system. It is very welcomed. It needs to be done in a proper way, in a proper format of availability of data and transparency. But it is indeed, I think, a positive development. And the last aspect I would highlight is about the code of conduct for members of parliaments. We have been supporting more than 25 national parliaments as OSCE ODIHR in adopting such documents since 10 years ago. And a few of them do have clear guidance on how elected officials need to approach lobbyists and the concept of lobbying. I think there is a need to have this element strongly in place within the Parliament of Latvia, reform the rules of procedure or the code of conduct as necessary to include this aspect, to make sure that really the interiorization of lobbying as a concept and as a practice is embraced by the elected officials. If I can have a few more minutes, I would highlight very quickly 3 challenges that I see for Latvia, but overall in general for those countries that want to adopt a law on lobbying in the next months. The first one is about clearly defining the scope of the law. And this was mentioned again by several of the previous presenters. It is about understanding when it comes to the registry, which remains the main instrument to regulate and to shape transparency on lobbying, who needs to register. There are different practices in many of our countries. Here, the recommendation, as Peter Varga was saying at the beginning, is to have the wider possible understanding on who needs to be part of this registry. The scope of the law needs to be as wide as possible. At the European Union, for example, you have consultancy lobbyists, you have in-house lobbyists and NGOs being part of this registry. In some countries, as in Lithuania, we hear, and in Poland as well, NGOs are not requested and required to be part of this registry. There are other exceptions, usually alongside political parties, religious organizations, and small businesses, for example, I believe in Ireland, and we will hear from our Irish friends after my presentation. Law firms are not required to register in Austria, which created a lot of problems. So having a clear understanding in Latvia of who needs to register, I think it's essential for the real success of the law on the long term. What needs to be reported? Here again, I think the broader we have an understanding of what needs to be made available as information, the better is for the quality of the decision-making process and its transparency. The usual understanding is that any oral, written, or electronic communication needs to be part of this registry and needs to be included there by those that are mandated to provide those information. In Austria, there is an obligation also to share financial information, which might be an interesting point to keep in mind. Again, in Ireland, also the intended results of the lobbying needs to be disclosed. That I think it would be something interesting to hear from our Irish friends. And then the last point, how often this register needs to be updated or information needs to be included there. Again, here there are different practices. Some countries have a bi-monthly deadline to update information, or 3 or 4 times a year. In other countries, is every 6 months. Regularly, sometimes as soon as something happens, those parts of the registry needs to update it. In France, is once a year. So it really differs, but this is also a key element that the legislation in Latvia needs to get right in consideration of the overall context of being a small country, and also in consideration of the power of those monitoring that registry. Which brings me to my second challenge, which is about securing effective oversight and proportionate sanctions. This is probably a discussion that will come down the line in drafting the law in Latvia, but few points that I think need to be clear. So the registry compliance is obviously a big part of that oversight and monitoring mechanism. It seems to me to understand from the principles that have been highlighted by the Parliament and the working group that there is an indication to split this monitoring and oversight responsibility between 2 agencies. I think if that's the way that Latvia would like to go, there is a need to really ensure communication and coordination between these 2 different agencies. They have to be, and they are already to a large extent in Latvia, very independent and well-resourced. So that needs to be maintained as a condition, but the coordination needs to be strengthened between those managing the registry and the agency that then will actually do the investigation of cases where the registry is not properly updated by those mandated to do so. Moving to the sanctions part, which is often a matter of heated discussion in countries adopting laws on lobbying. You have, again, different practices in OSCE countries. Usually you have a soft approach sometimes about naming and shaming for those that fail to register. You have the measure of removing from the registry those that are not complying with the requirements. You have in many countries some option to impose fines, administrative fines. In Slovenia, you have a range between 400 and 100,000 euros, actually, a very large amount. In Austria, is 60,000. In France, 15,000. So that's always a practice that many countries are following. And then there is the imprisonment component. In a few countries, there is also that element that maybe, again, Irish friends can tell us a little bit more about. The last point I wanted to mention in terms of oversight and sanctions, it's the importance of really paying attention to the access of this information and the disclosure element of it. The way that the website will be built, the way that the registry information will be made available to the public, in which format, it really is a key component of the success of this law. The monitoring and the oversight has to be done by the proper agency that will be identified, but it is also a matter of interest for the public, for those organizations that are looking into these issues. So they do need to have access to those documents, to those data, to really perform an oversight role. The last challenge, very quickly, something that is really close to my heart, really. It is about the cultural dimension of lobbying and how do we raise awareness around this issue. As many other issues that deal with integrity, it's not about punishing, it's not about enforcing compliance. It is about raising integrity and changing a culture within the institutions that we are working with. So here, there are a number of steps that need to be taken, I believe. One of them is adoption of a code of conduct, both on the side of the business community, as well as on the side of the government officials, the elected officials in parliament, the public administration, and that code needs to be made operational. Not much about the sanctioning part of the code when it's breached, but more about how to keep it alive as a document to create a platform for discussing these issues. An advisory body, I think that's very important. Within the parliament, you have that kind of integrity advisor in parliaments like in France and in the Netherlands that can actually tell MPs how to behave in accordance to a given situation in matters of lobbying as well, and provide clarity in that sense. The importance of creating training and guiding material for public officials mainly, but also business community, to understand how to maintain the process of decision-making and lobbying itself as transparent as possible. So this overall practice of raising awareness among the public, it's very important. We need to get rid of this image of lobbying being something negative, because it's not. So that needs to happen through the awareness raising campaigns that the parliament, that the government, the business community itself need to promote. How can the OSCE assist you? Very quickly, I will wrap up. In several ways, I believe, and I'm targeting this to the parliament mainly. The first one is by producing a legal opinion. I do understand that the work of the working group will then result soon in a draft law that will then be put for public consultation, something that is very, very good, as I mentioned before. We do stand ready as well as OSCE ODIHR to produce a legal opinion upon your request on the law on lobbying, but also on the rules of procedure that I understand the Parliament is looking to amend. This is free for you. You can just send a simple email to myself or the office address and request a legal opinion on the draft that you develop. And we will do so hiring the best international experts and using in-house expertise. The second assistance we can offer is to facilitate an exchange of practice. In normal times, we would offer you a study visit to another country where you can learn on how the law on lobbying is actually implemented, or we could organize an international roundtable bringing in experiences from other countries. If the pandemic is still with us, we can try to do this virtually for you and organize it for you on your behalf. The third element is technical assistance. Serbia adopted a law on lobbying 2 years ago, and in 2019 we have been highly engaged in Serbia, offering training to the staff of the anti-corruption agency in Serbia, which was the body responsible for the implementation of the law. We have been helping them in designing bylaws and regulations. We drafted with them the code of conduct for lobbyists. We worked with the parliament to raise awareness among MPs on the requirements of the law on lobbying. We are ready to do this also with our Latvian friends and with you. The last element, it's about reviewing the Parliament's Code of Conduct. As I mentioned, this is something we have been working highly over the last years. We do have quite a lot of expertise in this area. We stand ready to see how the Code of Conduct can include better the dimension of lobbying and be of service and guidance to the elected officials in Latvia. I will stop here. Thank you very much. You can reach me on this email address anytime, and I hope to continue to be engaged in this process of developing and legislation in Latvia. Thanks a lot.